Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of WN Movie Talk Podcast, formerly known as We Need to Talk About Movies Podcast. I am Trev and I'm here today on my own again. It's one of those special episodes where I talk in sort of detail about the production of a film. Previously I've visited the Terminator films as well as the very first Harry Potter, but today I'm going to discuss a film that I think is one of the greatest comedy films of the 80s. It's certainly the best in the franchise that it spawned, and it is the 1984's Ghostbusters, directed by Ivan Reitman, written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, and starring Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, and Rick Moranis, Sigourney Weaver, and Ernie Hudson. Now, I remember Ghostbusters. It was one of my very first sort of cinema memories. I would have been 4 years old. It was actually released in America on my birthday, but over here I think we probably got it later, but I remember we went to the cinema to watch it. I think I even went twice. I think I went with my mum at first and then with friends afterwards. And yeah, as soon as it came out on VHS, we used to hire it all the time from our local shop. Then when it was on TV, we recorded it off the telly and, I would watch it over and over and over. I was really into the real Ghostbusters at the time. Really excited for Ghostbusters 2 to come out, but never, even at a young age, Ghostbusters 2 didn't really do it for me. I never watched it half as much. But yeah, there's something about Ghostbusters that still to this day I watch. And I still love it. There's quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to get straight on with it. It's no secret that Ghostbusters was written by Dan Aykroyd as a vehicle for Dan Aykroyd and his then comedic partner, John Belushi. Aykroyd and Belushi had had success with the likes of Blues Brothers and Saturday Night Live, and Aykroyd's original screenplay had John Belushi in mind to play the Murray role, Pete Venkman. Aykroyd had had a family history with paranormal investigations and seances. His great-grandfather, Samuel Aykroyd, was a paranormal investigator who would travel the country viewing and reviewing mediums and psychics for authenticity, and who had acquired and collected lots of literature published from the cyclical research societies of America and Britain. And it was the contents of these very books and his grandfather's own journals that inspired Dan Aykroyd to begin to develop a treatment for a brand new supernatural comedy in the style of the old Bob Hope ghost hunter movies of the 1940s. The title of the film during the first draft of this treatment was then Ghost Smashers. The screenplay and concept was colossal and included plots such as interdimensional time travel. According to Reitman and Ramis in the documentary Cleaning Up the Town and also the Ghostbusters fandom wiki page, Aykroyd's screenplay was set in the future of 2012. And in a lengthy prologue, the story explains that at some point a hole had been torn in the fabric of space and time, which had opened up a gateway from our dimension into the next, which led to the invasion of various spirits and monstrous apparitions into our world. At the beginning of the movie, the job of a ghost smasher had already been an important and well-established career path for many in the world, and had at some point become as common and mundane as plumbers, with many teams of Ghostbusters already working and competing against each other for business. Venkman, Stantz and the third character, then known as Ramsey, were already a team of ghost hunters in service. Aykroyd said that the names were based on all of the famous German scientists he always seemed to read about. The characters weren't fleshed out, and a lack of unique characters meant that they were practically indistinguishable from one another on the page. The treatment, however, did include Zool and Gozor and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, who was only one of many gigantic creatures created by Gozer to destroy the Earth. Even Slimer made an appearance in the original concept, but he was a far more sinister character than he ended up being. Ramis declared that the final act of Aykroyd's treatment saw the Ghost Smashers whisked off into an alternative dimension and would have been one massive collage of special effects, hardly practical or cheap enough for production during the early 80s. So let's have a look at that a minute. I mean, Aykroyd's original script would have been completely different. It's one of them things you think, well, maybe that's how they could take it these days, have established Ghostbusters and have like a rivalry thing. They're not the only ones doing it. That might work for a new direction of the franchise, or maybe like an animated movie or something would work. I don't know. Or maybe it's just best to leave it where it is. I mean, Dan Aykroyd is famous for writing huge, overblown treatments for things. I think the original script of the Blues Brothers that he wrote, John Landis referred to as it being the size of a phone book, and they had to really slash it back. So yeah, he's got this wild imagination, and when he starts writing, he can't seem to stop. With Aykroyd and Belushi originally taking the lead roles, the third wheel in the cog, Egon Spengler, was offered around to stars such as Christopher Walken, Jeff Goldblum, John Lithgow and Christopher Lloyd. But however, two things put a spanner in the works for the production of Ghostbusters. One was the untimely death of John Belushi, who together with Aykroyd had been box office gold. Aykroyd said that he had just written a line of Venkman's dialogue when he received the call informing him of his partner's untimely death. The other hindrance in the production of Ghostbusters was Dan Aykroyd's first movie after Belushi's death, a film called Dr. Detroit, in which Aykroyd took the lead role, headlining a movie alone for the first time, playing a college professor of literature who agrees to take care of the cool girls for a pimp on the run. The film barely made its money back, and Aykroyd's career and clout waned somewhat in Hollywood. Hollywood is a fickle place, and Aykroyd was finding it hard enough to get work, let alone produce his own. Meanwhile, another duo who were on the up in Hollywood were the pairing of Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor, who had seen increasing popularity with the successes of films such as Silver Streak and Stir Crazy. The film that they was in talks of producing at the time was a comedy of race and class called, back then, Black and White, and told the story of a rich white man and a poor black man who are forced to swap positions in society. When Richard Pryor set himself on fire and nearly killed himself while freebasing crack cocaine, the script for Black and White was passed over to the director John Landis. Landis, who was also on a roll after directing a string of hits including Animal House, The Blues Brothers and American Werewolf in London, and having worked with Aykroyd before, championed Aykroyd for the Gene Wilder role. And Eddie Murphy, also successful from Saturday Night Live and 48 Hours, was to take the Richard Pryor role. Of course, the film became Trading Places and was both a critical and commercial hit, once again giving Aykroyd a little more clout. Aykroyd began to rewrite the screenplay for Ghostbusters again. Having enjoyed working with Murphy on Trading Places, he wrote a role in the script for him too, a fourth Ghostbuster, Winston Zeddemore. Murphy would eventually turn down the role and go on to work on Beverly Hills Cop, which was originally intended for Sylvester Stallone, who the studios decided to leave as his suggestions were increasingly costly, and so the script was altered to suit Murphy and became more of a comedy. Stallone took his ideas and created Cobra. The Murphy role of Winston Zeddemore was kept in the treatment, but reduced quite a lot. In memory of the late Belushi, Aykroyd created the green slobbish ghost of Slimer, a ghostly homage to Belushi's character Bluto from National Lampoon's Animal House. Aykroyd was still passing the treatment around and trying to fill the hole in the lead role left by Belushi, offering it up to actors such as Tom Hanks, Chevy Chase, Michael Keaton and Steve Guttenberg, all of whom turned it down. Aykroyd needed a director to attach to the project, and his agent Mike Ovitz suggested Canadian director-producer Ivan Reitman, who also worked on his agency and had worked for a producer on numerous movies, including David Cronenberg's Shivers and Rabid amongst them, and also John Landis's Animal House. But he found success as a director on comedy movies Meatballs and Stripes, starring the up-and-coming comic actor Bill Murray. It was Reitman who suggested to Aykroyd that the ambitious and impossible screenplay would need scaling back somewhat, and he started by suggesting that it would take place in the present day and that it would also benefit the audience to see the Ghostbusters origin story, so that they were taken along the journey and watch these amateur professionals finding their own way. So they soon became college professors with an interest in the paranormal, and the real-world New York worked as a terrific juxtaposition to the supernatural elements of the story. He also suggested bringing in Harold Ramis, another comic writer, actor and director, to help bring the script back down to earth, and having some background in comedy performances, suggested that he should create a role for himself as the third Ghostbuster, who would become Egon Spengler. Ramis, who had been a comedy writer and sometimes performer on films such as Animal House, Caddyshack, which he also directed, Stripes and Meatballs, all of which featured comedy performances from another rising Saturday Night Live star, Bill Murray, and it soon became evident to both Ramis and Aykroyd that it should be Murray who was offered the lead role as Venkman. Murray had worked with Ramis as part of the Second City, a Chicago-based comedy troupe that had seen many great comedy performers pass through its doors, such as Belushi and Aykroyd, Alan Alda, who would later become famous for playing Hawkeye in the TV sitcom MASH, Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara, who's still going strong as a married couple in hit comedy series Schitt's Creek, as well as John Candy and Rick Moranis. Through Second City TV, or SCTV, many of the troupe's alumni would go on to work on Saturday Night Live and would carve themselves lasting careers in both TV and film. In May 1983, Reitman took the script to producer Frank Price over at Columbia Pictures. Price had produced Stripes, which was directed by Reitman, and which grossed $80 million from a $10 million budget. Reitman pitched the new concept for Ghostbusters. The producer liked the sound of it and asked what kind of a budget that would require. On the spot and out of his depth, Reitman literally held the script in his hand as he plucked a figure from the air and said, somewhere about $30 million. And he agreed to have the film completed by June of 1984, giving him just over a year. 13 months to complete the picture. At this point, they had no completed script, no special effects department, and practically no clue of how to progress. They were going to be pushed to the limits to see that this film was completed on time. Aykroyd, Ramis and Reitman bolted themselves into Aykroyd's villa on Martha's Vineyard, a seaside haven for wealthy Hollywood types, and location of Amity Island in Spielberg's Jaws some years before. Together they spent 2 weeks hammering out the script. With actors in mind for the three main roles, the characters of Reitman, Stantz and Spengler soon began to take on individual forms designed to show the attributes of each actor. Despite rewrites aimed towards Murray was actually reluctant to take the role. He had a personal project on the go which gave him a serious lead role, which he hoped would help to staple his career as a serious actor. It was a film called Razor's Edge. He bartered with Columbia producer Frank Price to fund and produce Razor's Edge if he agreed to be in Ghostbusters. A deal was struck and it looked like Murray would be on board, although many questioned whether he would have shown up for Ghostbusters if Razor's Edge hadn't failed to become a hit. Now we get on to casting the remaining characters. Dana Barrett's character wasn't as fully formed in the screenplay as she ended up being in the film. And Ramis openly admits that he was accused of writing paper-thin female roles back then. It wasn't until Sigourney Weaver auditioned for the role that it started to take on a more solid form. Initially, the guys weren't convinced that she would be right for the role, having been made famous for some much more serious roles such as Ripley in Ridley Scott's sci-fi horror Alien and Jill Bryant in Peter Weir's drama The Year of Living Dangerously, alongside Mel Gibson. Reitman said that she suggested her character should be possessed in the film, which at first he found off-putting. But once she began the audition and started leaping around the office as a dog, snarling, howling, chewing the furniture, he said he was blown away. He also considered her to have not only a great screen presence, but was an actress who he felt had the confidence to stand her own against the likes of Bill Murray. She was soon hired and the script was altered to make the most of her, with the possession subplot added for good measure. Ramis admits that her involvement made them all step up their game, and even Murray felt a little overwhelmed by her, and added the line, "I'll prove myself to you," as recognition to his own performance alongside such a great actress. Daryl Hannah was among other actresses that had auditioned for the role of Dana. In the screenplay, the character of Lewis Tully, the nerdy neighbour of Dana Barrett, was written with John Candy in mind, another Second City alumni. Even the storyboards were drawn with Candy in them. However, when the role was offered to Candy, he got hung up on the idea of his character being a German and wanted 2 large German shepherd dogs with him, which Reitman balked at, especially as the screenplay already contained the terror dogs, and he explained people would just find it confusing. Ramis claimed that he also wanted too much money, and so the role was offered to yet another Second City performer, Rick Moranis, who thought that the screenplay was the greatest thing he'd ever read and leapt at the chance. This was a breakout role for Moranis, and one that still holds its own against the other characters. His talking at 100 miles an hour, trying too hard to reach out to Dana, is just comedy gold. He'd ad-libbed many of his own lines, especially when it came to the dull intricacies of tax information in the party scene. This dialogue was plucked from his extensive tax knowledge thanks to his previous career as an accountant. Also, later in the script, he gets possessed by a spirit of the Keymaster, which is ironic as the character of Lewis Tully locks himself out of his apartment 3 times in the movie. The role of Winston Zeddemore, once written with Eddie Murphy in mind, was given to Ernie Hudson. At the time he signed on the dotted line, the script contained a fuller part, which saw Winston enter the film much earlier and had a background story and some of the best lines of the film. As filming took place, his role was drastically scaled back, his character history was slashed, and the great lines were very often given to Murray. Hudson has admitted that this was a difficult time for him, and he felt like he was being pushed out. It was Ramis he would turn to console and convince him that this was no way a personal attack. It was just simply Hollywood. Paul Rubens, also known as Pee Wee Herman, was originally in mind to play Gozer before she became a female goddess. Annie Potts landed the role of the bespectacled receptionist Janine Melnitz. In the early drafts of the script, the storyline was explored where she and Egon began a relationship, but the idea was dropped as it made more sense for Egon to have as little emotional connection to anyone. However, the chemistry between Potts and Ramis on screen eventually led to the romance being hinted at in the final movie. William Atherton would be cast as the film's antagonist, Walter Peck, a fastidious official type who demands that the containment unit will be shut down. His role was so memorable as the villain of the piece that he would often be taunted on the streets by children shouting, "Hey, Dickless!" repeating one of Bill Murray's ad-libbed lines from the film. Atherton would go on to play a similarly disliked character in the Die Hard films. And Stephen Tash, the guy in the film's opening scene as the gawky student who Murray keeps electrocuting in a futile and somewhat biased attempt to study ESP and mind reading, said that he was fortunate to get the role because as he awaited the audition, another actor waiting with him was chewing gum. Tash asked for a piece of gum and was called in first. And when he feigned electrocution, he spat the gum out, which creased everyone up, and he is sure that is what earned him the role. Reitman needed a good special effects house to take on the numerous visual effects shots required for the film. As he approached ILM, the only effects house in town at the time, they declined, having been busy working on films such as Indiana Jones and The Temple of Doom, among other projects. So he then turned to Richard Edlund. Richard Edlund was a special effects artist who had worked with ILM for many years on the Star Wars movies, as well as Poltergeist and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Edlund features heavily in the fantastic documentary series Light and Magic, which is streaming now on Disney+, really worth having a look at. It chronicles the meteoric rise of the Industrial Light and Magic from their founding days working on George Lucas's original Star Wars films until their more modern innovations now. Anyway, Edlund, he left ILM. He said it was becoming a bit too corporate, so he left to start his own production company, Boss Films, and took on Ghostbusters as one of his earliest projects, building his effects department up from scratch from a studio purchased from special effects maestro Douglas Trumbull, who had worked on films as 2001 and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. One of the first questions that Reitman and the effects team needed to answer was whether the ghost would be frightening or comical, which would be answered with each ghost in turn. The first ghost we see, the librarian ghost, it was important for her to be as realistic and familiar as possible, and then to scare the bejeebers out of the audience to shock and draw them into the film. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Ghosts such as Slimer and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man were to have slightly more comical cartoon leaning, whilst other ghosts such as the librarian ghost and the taxi driver would be far more frightening, both of which were down to creature designer Steve Johnson to create. Johnson was relatively young at the time and he had applied for a job with Edlund's effects company to work on the film, and as an audition they requested that he go away and in a month create an animatronic zombie taxi driver to be filmed on location. If it worked, he got the job. This scene was filmed alongside many shots in and around the streets of New York on the first day of filming. Not officially the first day, but a day of pre-production shots that Reitman thought made sense to get out of the way whilst they had cast and crew on location, and also to help them keep ahead of a really tight schedule. Obviously, the zombie driver with gnarled, decomposed skin and cigarette hanging from his mouth worked well. The shots made it into the film, and Johnson got his job. Other scenes filmed on that first day in October of 1983 were a newscaster reporting on the success of this new team of ghost experts, as well as a shot of the three main actors running up a New York street. Both shots would appear in the montage scene in the middle of the film, where their enterprise starts to become a success. A lot of the film's initial designs came along with Aykroyd's early treatment and had been pretty much established by Aykroyd and his old college friend John DeVicus. Aykroyd had already seen the Ecto-1 as being a Cadillac hearse. If you know Aykroyd, he loves his cars as well, is another thing he loves, so he would have had this vision of the Ecto-1 in his head all that time, which is, what's the best way to take ghosts out? In a hearse. Makes sense. And also the proton packs and the logo were mostly sketched out how they would be seen in the film. The siren of the Ecto-1 is actually the howl of a leopard played backwards and tweaked slightly. The logo was described as Casper trapped behind a hazard sign, and Slimer in the script was described as a green potato-like ghost. Steve Johnson would create Slimer as a suit in which a puppeteer would wear over their torso, using their own arms as Slimer's arms, whilst his legs would be blacked out, and the various additional puppeteers would stand behind and could move Slimer's sort of elasticated facial features. Also, obviously, they would be blacked out for the composite shot. But Johnson was also assigned to create the Librarian Ghost, which is a marvellous, effective puppet. It had numerous moving parts which had to snap to life in an instant. You know, its brow would rise, its mouth would snarl, its teeth would pop out, its skin would peel back. But it all had to happen instantaneously, morphing it from this old lady to a demonic ghost in a single shot. You know, and it's just literally about 26 frames or something like that. It's a real quick shot. At first, the logistics of this seemed almost impossible to pull off in a single shot, requiring numerous puppeteers to operate the various elements of the puppet. And with more hands on deck, that meant more hands that would have to be precise, which was always a hard task to achieve. So, alongside mechanical engineer John Alberti, Steve Johnson eventually managed to design the puppet with each operation controlled by just one man sat behind a lever. A groundbreaking device which saved a lot of time and money and created a real-time special effect that still holds up as authentic and shocking today. A great first ghost to show the audience, to draw them in. A lot of the film's exterior shots were to take place in New York, with filming sometimes causing tailbacks right across the city, as the roads that were closed for filming were the main traffic arteries through New York. In one shot, the ground outside of Dana's apartment is torn and there is a car sinking into the ground. Traffic would be driving past, looking at this police car that seems to be eaten up by this big hole in the ground. Obviously, when this was on location, this shot was filmed with an above-ground set dressing of the car and torn-up road, because obviously they weren't allowed to dig up the roads of New York. So the shots where the car actually sank into the ground and the roads physically rose and opened were filmed on a soundstage at Burbank Studio in LA, where they had built a replica of the front of Dana's building. The first days or weeks of filming proved a strain on the already tight schedule, as Columbia Studios were having a nightmare trying to acquire the rights to the film's title, Ghostbusters. Film Nation, the animation studio behind the He-Man cartoons, also had a cartoon series running which was called Ghostbusters, and when filming any parts of the script with any writing or dialogue mentioning the word Ghostbusters, they would have to be filmed twice with a backup shot with the title Ghost Breakers, just in case they couldn't secure the rights. Obviously, this is no way to continue a production, and this is where the stories vary. The documentary Cleaning Up the Town reports that I think it was the production designer phoned up the studio during a scene with many New York extras chanting Ghostbusters and said, "Listen to this, we need to get the rights to this now." Whereas the Netflix episode of The Movies That Made Us claims that the deal was struck when producer Frank Price, who was fired by Columbia as new heads took over, found his way over to Universal Pictures, who just happened to own the rights to Film Nation and incidentally the Ghostbusters cartoon. And so he helped out the production team by securing them a deal. Regardless, eventually a deal was made and production could continue in earnest with Ghostbusters safely used as a title. There was much ad-libbing taking place throughout the film, with the three main actors riffing off of each other, much to the annoyance of some of the more professional actors involved in minor roles, who were predominantly theatre-trained and would find it hard to time their lines. But getting professional actors in the minor roles is another thing which makes Ghostbusters so funny, especially in comparison to its sequels. The main characters are the comical characters, and everyone else plays it straight. In the scene where the Ghostbusters are roaming the hotel and blast at the old maid pushing the trolley was loaded up with pyrotechnics, but the extra wasn't told of the extent of the explosion when the Ghostbusters blast their proton packs at her. When the trolley erupted, the extra flew to the floor, hiding for cover behind the trolley, and then peering round at the trolley, she asked the crew, "What the hell are you doing?" Which was a line so perfect and performed with such a natural reaction that it's made its way into the film. A lot of the internal locations were filmed on the soundstage in LA. The main set built was the colossal set that would become the top of Dana's building at the film's finale. A set so impressive that even Steven Spielberg came to have a look. The fire station used in the film as the Ghostbusters HQ was actually two similar design fire stations. The exterior filmed in New York and the interior filmed in a fire station in LA. The script called for a shot of the concrete gargoyles transitioning into a horrific pterodox, but the last minute to save costs and not to add pressures to the VFX team, it was traded for a practical effect of having the dogs break through the concrete as though they had been cased inside. Tensions began to rise between Reitman and the effects team as the shoot came to a halt and the effects were added to existing footage in post-production. The usual specific care had not been taken to time the camera work for the overlaying of special effects, and some shots, most famously the shot where the terror dog leaps out of the foyer of the hotel and bounds across the road, weren't quite up to scratch. Because there were no effects guys on location when the shot was made, they would have been there to time and measure the movements and distances of the camera so that they could completely match it in the studio with the little animated puppet. So by the time they came to animate the dog and overlay the footage, they were really just lining up the movements by eye. The ride towards the end of the production was a hectic one for Boss Films and the special effects crew. They had no time to turn around, and many of the shots they gave Reitman as first drafts, just to see which way he wanted to go from there, just instantly found themselves going straight into the edit. This is how close to the deadline the production went. So when Reitman turned up one day, requested 100 additional special effects shots with just several weeks before the completion date, it's no surprise that Richard Edlund met him in the Boss Films car park armed with a samurai sword. He said, "We can't do this. We have to do the samurai cut if we are going to finish this film on time," and managed to talk Reitman into requesting just 50 additional visuals, pushing the effects a staggering 150,000 over budget. Reitman and many of the effects team didn't know whether they had gone too far into the stupidity and cartoonishness with many of the ghosts. They didn't know if it would work with audiences. And Reitman absolutely dreaded how the audiences would take the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man was one of the last scenes to be filmed. Basically a man in a styrofoam suit walking through a miniature cityscape. The actor inside was given the direction of walking as if you were light because you were made of marshmallow, but heavy in that you were the size of a skyscraper. Actually, not a bad direction, I guess, because the finished walk is quite convincing and does a good job of conveying both. As mentioned, no one really knew how this would hold up, whether it let the film down, but so late in the day they were committed and had no choice but to keep on plugging away at it. They had a number of Stay Puft Marshmallow Man suits designed to be filmed from different angles, including 18 costumes costing $20,000 each that were lined up to be set alight. In the end, 17 of them were destroyed. So late in the day was the completion of the Marshmallow Man scenes that one of the ladies on the Creature Shop team said that she was driving on her way to the studio where they still had numerous shots to complete, and she passed a huge billboard that had gone up advertising Ghostbusters with the release date, which was just literally a couple of weeks away. She was positive they was never going to make it. In March 1984, just months before the June 8th release date, a very early draft of Ghostbusters was put into test screenings with practically none of the visual effects in place. Many of the key shots were missing, and there was just one single shot of Mr. Stay Puft's head moving past the tops of buildings. When Ivan Reitman was sat with the audience and they saw that happen, the audience just went wild. And he started to feel a bit more confident. But then his confidence peaked when at that test screening, I don't know if you know about test screenings, but Hollywood will make a film and then they'll put it out to audiences and they'll test it and see if the audiences like it, and then they can make changes based on those test scores. And the score out of 100, and this is so rare, but Ghostbusters had an audience score in the late 90s, which is absolutely unheard of, and it became clear that day that they may have a success story on their hands. As the film completed, the film credits were also rushed, and out of 160 members of the special effects team, over 100 of them had their names left off of the end credits. Dave was quite miffed about this, obviously, but Richard Edlund took it upon himself to take out a full page in Variety magazine where he wrote an apology and listed every single member of the team that had helped with the production of the film. Ghostbusters would go on to become the surprise hit of 1984, grossing more than two Spielberg projects released in that year, Temple of Doom and Gremlins. Altogether, it grossed nearly $300 million worldwide. It catapulted Bill Murray's career into the stratosphere and launched Ghostbusters as the franchise that we know now. Elmer Bernstein's score throughout the film is a fantastic touch. It flips from the comedic tones of the Ghostbusters main theme not the Ray Parker song. The romantic music of Dana's theme and the simplicity and haunting supernatural mysticism of the library score to the bombastic, ominous fanfare of the Gozers theme. The music was what made this film what it was, and it wasn't until recently hearing that score reprised in the Jason Reitman sequel, Ghostbusters Afterlife, that I soon realised what had been missing from the two films in between. But it was Ray Parker Jr.'s title song that would become the hit of the summer and a staple for Halloween discos forevermore. Ray Parker Jr.'s song hit the top of the charts worldwide, making Ray Parker Jr. a household name and even received him an Oscar nomination. Apart from Ghostbusters, though, I don't think I could name another Ray Parker Jr. song. Any of you out there name one? Let me know. Anyway, he had struggled like mad to fit the title word into the song, and it was only in the last minute, whilst watching an advert for pest control exterminators on TV, that he thought of the now famous tagline, "Who you gonna call?" That's how he saw it, as an advert, and that's how he managed to get it into the song. He quickly recorded the song onto a tape cassette, sent it off to Reitman for approval, and Reitman subsequently cut that taped version straight into the film's opening scene. The special effects team also received an Oscar nomination, although they ultimately lost out to ILM for their work on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. When Reitman was given the nod to make Ghostbusters 2 5 years later, he would again request that ILM took on the special effects contract. And this time, despite having another indie film and Back to the Future 3 in production, they accepted, leaving Boss Films high and dry. Boss Films, however, stayed around for another 15 years and were the biggest competition to ILM. They helped the visual effects in many films, including Big Trouble in Little China, Ghost, Die Hard, Poltergeist 2, Batman Returns, Alien 3. Boss Films eventually shut down in 1997, stating it was struggling to stay afloat with the abundance of competition. This would have been just a year or two after ILM went digital with Jurassic Park, and everything changed. So it does make you wonder if that was a factor in the studio's demise. Harold Ramis would go on to have a successful career directing movies such as Groundhog Day, Multiplicity, Analyze This and Bedazzled. In fact, he and Murray would have a falling out during the production of Groundhog Day, which saw them give each other the cold shoulder until reunited whilst Ramis was on his deathbed. Rick Moranis would become successful in the aftermath of Ghostbusters 2, starring in Little Shop of Horrors, Spaceballs and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, amongst others. But his career was cut short with the death of his wife, and he withdrew from the public eye to focus on his family. Ghostbusters led to the immediate launch of the Real Ghostbusters animated series. Egon became white hair, Winston lost his moustache, Janine became a punky-looking redhead as opposed to a nanny-looking attire from the film, and Slimer became a central character and ally of the Ghostbusters. An interesting little fact is that the Bill Murray character of Pete Venkman would go on to be voiced by a voice actor called Lorenzo Music in the Ghostbusters cartoon. Lorenzo Music also voiced the animated version of Garfield, who Bill Murray would go on to voice in a later film version. The production of the cartoon would, in effect, go on to dumb down the sequel, which, produced 5 years later, struggled to find its identity, as it didn't really know whether it wanted to be a sequel to the film or a sequel to the cartoon. Also, the second film I found was riddled with lines of dialogue which wanted to reproduce the classic quotes from the first, but none of which had that desired effect. What made the original so great was that the classic lines such as "we came, we saw, we kicked its ass" were usually off-the-cuff responses made up by Murray and the boys. The third instalment would see Paul Feig directing an all-female cast, which, whilst it didn't upset me as it had many fans, it did struggle with its identity and who exactly it was aiming at. I quite like the effects in this version, and there were some great gags and set pieces, but what failed for me was how lampoonish everyone was in the movie. Not just the main cast, but every single supporting role seemed to be jostling for the laughs. The original film worked so well because of the straight-faced New York backdrop the main cast were fooling around in front of. And Ghostbusters Afterlife, although has been a better success than the other sequels, to me it's a shameful fan-pleasing rehash of the first film, using the Stranger Things model of having kids take the main roles. It was good to see the main cast reunite in the end, with a sincerely touching homage to the late Harold Ramis. The film was okay, but it's never left me wanting to rewatch it. The same could be said with my son, who has watched the first film several times. It just goes to show you cannot plan the success of a film, even if it's an established franchise. The success of 1984's Ghostbusters remains a surprise, lightning in a bottle success that hit the mark at just the right time, leaving an indelible imprint on the generation who were raised on it. Well, that's about all that I have time for. That's about all I've got to say. I hope you enjoyed that. A bit nerdy, I know, but I love to be a nerd. So, that was my everything you need to know about Ghostbusters. If you enjoy this show, then please do subscribe or like, share us to get us to new audiences. Give us a rating on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. That means a lot. And also, stay tuned for more movie talk coming very shortly. I do have a bit of an announcement to make. My brother Robin has left the podcast. His life's becoming pretty busy and we keep meaning to meet up and it never happens. So he's just bowed out. I have got Stan, who's agreed to join me at the moment. You might have heard our RoboCop podcast. So we've got another podcast lined up to do very shortly. So hopefully that will be out next week. But apart from that, I'm going to be just doing a lot more on my own, I should think, just to keep it going. So I hope that you enjoy hearing me nerd out about films. Please, if you do, go and like us over on Facebook, WN Movie Talk podcast over at Facebook, and just drop a comment underneath this episode and just say if you like this sort of thing or not. It'd be really interesting to hear some feedback. So anyway, I'm Trev. This has been WN Movie Talk podcast. We have just learned everything you need to know about Ghostbusters. See you all again soon. Chase!
The family